Hello, and thank you for joining us for the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics podcast, Narcotics News, the podcast discussing all things OBN. On today's episode, we are joined by special guests to discuss fentanyl. Hope you enjoy.
I'd like to welcome our guest here today. First of all, to the right of me, Commissioner Hodges, welcome. Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, Director of OSBI, Angela Spurlock, and Sheriff Tommy Johnson of Oklahoma County. Welcome. Thank y'all so much for being here today. Sheriff, I would like to start with you, if you don't mind. Being the sheriff of the largest county in the state of Oklahoma, or the most populated county in the state of Oklahoma, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing with fentanyl, what's going on in your county.
So fentanyl, we're seeing it regardless if you are a field guy, just a patrol deputy, or if you're on commit. And it is coming in droves. Our commit guys were telling us today that they are seeing it come through in such large quantities. It takes a lot of manpower to work it. And then the fact that fentanyl is being laced in every other drug. And I think that is so important because we understand that a granular amount of fentanyl can be an overdose amount. And people can die just from a granular amount over. And we're seeing it laced in methamphetamines, we're seeing it laced in cocaine, we're seeing the M30 pills come out. And this isn't just in our adult communities. These are in our schools. I mean, these kids are getting access to this and it's everywhere. I will tell you, it's one of the drug epidemics that we are fighting that if we don't get a hold of real quick, I can see it getting out of control.
Yes, and I'll get into this a little bit more with the commissioner here a little bit, but actually the number one killer right now between the age of 18 and 45 in the U.S. is a fentanyl drug overdose. So that's something that, it's here and it's being here, but it's also something that I think that we're going to see. Our numbers dropped a little bit on our overdoses this last year, but we'll talk about xylazine and some other things here in a minute why we think that's going to go up. But also, so people know, tell them what commit is, because I don't think, so our listeners know what commit is when we talk about it.
So commit is our interdiction team, and that's our task force, and we are partnered with Oklahoma City Police Department as well as the Oklahoma County District Attorney's Office. That is what the organizations that form commit, and they work our highways and interstate systems to fight the war on drugs.
So they're not just seeing what's locally, you also, with your interdiction team, you think they're also seeing things that are going to other states as well, coming through Oklahoma.
100%. Obviously, a lot of the cases can't be talked about, but there will be stops that happen that lead to bust in other communities elsewhere in other states. I mean, this is definitely a major thoroughfare right here with our I-35 and 40 traffic that we got. And it's something that you heard about. I knew I heard about it years ago when I was on the road, but it's nothing now to see our guys and to see the reports come by with fentanyl. And it's amazing the amounts that they're getting off just regular people. And then when we talk about the element of in the county jail, we were seeing fentanyl overdoses in the county jail. And so it can get anywhere. And I think that's it's the big thing about it, that we got to control it, because for such a small amount to be so catastrophic, it's very dangerous for our community.
Absolutely. And you talk about your jail. There's also the Department of Corrections that are having fentanyl drug overdoses. And it's not just in Oklahoma, it's in jails all across the U.S. So it is something that we do need to make people aware of. But also one of the things that what really concerns me is that the younger people.
Yes, sir.
And we'll talk a little bit about how fatal this can be, but a lot, and you kind of hit on it a little bit when you talked about every other drug being adulterated with fentanyl. What people don't realize is if you're buying a narcotic and it's not coming from your doctor, because the cartels got really good about counterfeiting these drugs that look like a Valium or looks like another prescription drug, almost 100% of these things contain fentanyl. So you have kids who are experimenting with what they think is a pharmaceutical that came from an actual company, came from the cartel in Mexico that manufactured, and it contains fentanyl, which only a very minute amount will kill them.
Yes, sir.
That's the concern, and that's something I think we have to really, put out to our youth. You got to really know what you're doing.
Yes.
And I don't think they're aware of that.
And I think that it's such a false sense of security is what they're seeing.
Yes.
You know, nowadays I think it's popular in our schools when we talk about the hydrocodone pills and the Lortabs, and the opioid pills that are going around that they're trying out. And you're right, you got these pills that are pressed down. They believe it to be this thing, and it's not. And this fentanyl is just so much more powerful than what they believe they're taking. It's having some deathly consequences.
Absolutely. Director Spurlock, being the director of OSBI, you also have and control our laboratory here in the state of Oklahoma, testing of all the drugs for all the law enforcement here. Can you tell us what you're seeing come to the lab, or numbers that you've seen as far as any increases or decreases with fentanyl coming into the labs?
Absolutely. In the last 7 years, we've seen about 1,000% increase in our testing of fentanyl. Pure fentanyl in this 2022 was about 114. Doesn't sound like a lot, but over 1,000 were some combination of other drugs that contain the fentanyl. So it absolutely plays into what you guys are talking about. They think they're getting something and it's actually this. And, additionally, in the lab that we have found when we are tracking the top 5 drugs that are involved in our traffic-related death investigations or our sexual assault investigations, we're seeing, of course, the methamphetamine and the amphetamine, but now fentanyl has, become part of that mixture, especially in the traffic deaths. So I, like you all, anticipate that that's going to continue to increase. And in addition to us dealing with it in the lab, typically OSBI, I say we're not the first responder as you guys are on the scene. We typically come in after to investigate. And even we are recently becoming involved in suspicious deaths that are fentanyl related and having to, go into those homes that have pure fentanyl powder and try to manage those scenes. We were talking before we came on about, our agents being exposed and getting ill and needing to call, the National Guard mass destruction team in. So it's absolutely affecting all of us in different but important ways. And as parents to, younger kids, it's absolutely terrifying to know what we know and not know exactly how you impact it in the best way. So
Absolutely. Thank you, Director. Commissioner, you had just not too long ago, we was able to sit down and talk. And first of all, I was totally enlightened by you. You actually had your stuff together on this, and I was really excited about you heading this agency up. First of all, a lot of people don't understand addiction. I mean, our common, everyday people don't, and there's been such a stigma put on addiction and mental health. But there is a direct correlation to some of this. And one, I think we got to do a better job as society to remove that stigma. And I think we've done a little bit, but I think we're far away from where we need to be. But there is a direct correlation to that. And can you expound on that a little bit about addiction and mental health and generational effects that this has, and what's happened generations ago to cause mental health, and to also allude to what's going on with addiction?
Well, a lot of people are familiar with the ACEs study that showed that when you're growing up, if you're exposed to what are considered traumatic events, that you are much more likely to experience mental health issues and substance abuse issues. And those things can be a variety of things, such as having an incarcerated parent. Well, we're going to be high for that in Oklahoma. A weather-related disaster, growing up in poverty, being an observer of domestic violence, which is very high in Oklahoma. So unfortunately, those types of things lead to Oklahoma being tied for number 1 in the nation for folks who have 4 or more ACEs in their score. So we have this plethora of people who experience trauma growing up, which there is tremendous amount of research that shows that directly correlates not only with mental health and addiction issues, but also health issues. And so when you look around our state and you see we have high rates of heart disease and blood pressure issues and diabetes, and we also then have high rates of mental health issues and high rates of addiction. So it all plays hand in hand. But it's often interesting on mental health and addiction as kind of which comes first, as the chicken or the egg scenario. Many people start to use substances to help alleviate emotional pain or experiences that they've had, or they don't exactly know how to cope with hard stressors that come with life. So they'll start using substances, or they'll start using substances to alleviate thinking that it will help with depression, or it will help with anxiety, or it will help with hearing voices, those types of things. What we know is that in the long run, of course, it just makes everything worse. And then you end up with both a mental health and an addiction issue. Your prognosis is much better in the long run if we're just treating your mental health issue. When you then combine it with an addiction issue as well, obviously that becomes much more complex. But we can and do treat persons every day with those. And most people who receive treatment will go on to live a successful life in recovery. And so treatment works, but you have to get people to be willing to engage in treatment and care.
Once again, we have to remove somewhat of that stigma.
There's a tremendous amount of stigma. It's interesting, there was a study done a few years ago, and it was Americans look at how people feel about mental health and addiction issues. And to me, I'm thinking, oh gosh, we've just come such a long way. But this study showed that people are fearful that if they seek care treatment, it's going to affect their job, it's going to affect their relationships within their family, that it could affect their marriage. And they truly have this very strong belief about that. And whether that's true or not would vary from person to person. But that is the biggest driver of why people don't get care and treatment.
Well, we know, just as recent as when we went through our COVID incident, we shut down treatment facilities. And we saw...
We did not, but lots of people
did. A lot of them did. Those numbers affected us dramatically.
Yes.
And we know that was because there was treatment wasn't as available to people.
Yes.
As prior to COVID. And those are numbers I think we have to be very much aware of and pay attention to, because we know treatment works. There's a lot of people in the background, and just because they're loud doesn't mean they're right, saying, why are we wasting all of our money on treatment? We will never arrest our way out of what's going on. We know that. But if we don't have treatment, if we don't have the funding, we don't have those dollars for treatment, we're getting nowhere real fast. And we do know that through COVID.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things when you talk about addiction and a perfect storm, residential substance abuse treatment, which is when, we use American Society of Addiction Medicine criteria. When a person meets the criteria for needing to come out of their community, go into a residential facility, then their addiction needs are pretty high. And that level of care was the most affected by COVID. Because number one, it's voluntary. And it's a congregate setting. And so people were completely afraid of going into a congregate setting. And so that was our most greatly affected. Now, I will say, as of today, we're back at pre-COVID levels of people entering treatment and being in residential substance abuse treatment. But there was a lot of people who were greatly affected during that time that we have perhaps lost to overdose deaths, or who are now in such throes of addiction that they are not getting help at this point in time, or they need some sort of intervention in order to get to that point in time.
There's a lot of moving parts. When you're a data person like me, we look at those numbers, it helps us strategically move on what we're doing. We know treatment's back up, numbers have dropped a little. There's some people trying to celebrate, saying that we're coming out of this thing. I think we're far from it. I think there's a lot of factors that contribute to the numbers dropping a little bit. One, treatment is back and going. Two, naloxone. It prevents, deaths, obviously, and we've done a better job putting this out everywhere, all across the U.S. So the numbers have dropped with that a little bit as well. And we talked a little bit before we came on. One of my biggest concerns is we start pulling back from treatment, or we start quit funding that stuff, but now we have a drug that's not even a controlled drug, that's been adulterated and introduced to almost all the other drugs again, including fentanyl. Every state in the United States now has tested positive for xylazine. Most people only know what xylazine is, especially unless you live in Oklahoma or on a farm, you understand what xylazine is. Can you explain to our listeners a little bit about xylazine and how it affects or doesn't help whenever we're using naloxone with fentanyl to bring someone back from an overdose?
Well, yes, I want to touch on a couple of things. Number one, this fiscal year that we're in, that's getting ready to end, our number of persons in treatment across the state will be greater than it was pre-COVID. So we are finally getting back on the trajectory we were on. And we're treating about 35,000 people annually for substance abuse addiction. So that's huge. Now, this past year, well, actually, there's a FY22, it's about 9,000 people specifically for opiate treatment that we have in treatment. But in addition to that, we have been throwing our resources at overdose deaths. And last week we had Overdose Awareness Day at the Capitol, and we rolled out a new campaign that we're doing. Now, this is aimed at fentanyl because it is the overdose deaths are the number one killer of people under 50 in our state and across the nation. It's just amazing that we're to that point. And as you mentioned, the majority of those deaths are a substance that is laced with fentanyl. But so you can get a reversal, a naloxone in our state. If you go to okimready.org, you can request naloxone for free and it will be sent to you. And I had a friend the other day that did that on a Saturday and received it by Monday. The other thing that we're doing right now is we're launching 44 vending machines that we're placing in high-risk areas around the state, whether that be hotels, casinos, different places, and all you have to do is enter your zip code and a 2-pack of naloxone will drop right down. And it also contains in there, number one, we send it out with every naloxone we send, but the vending machines contain it too, is fentanyl test strips. And so we try to teach people, and you'll see a lot of media around this coming your way, that test anything that you are going to ingest. Like you say, unless it's coming from a doctor or a pharmacy, you need to test it. Because in particular, our youth and young adults, as you mentioned, are buying these pills that are pressed, and they're thinking they're taking Xanax. They think they're taking, I'm just going to try what it's like to take a pain pill, and they're dying from this. So the test strips will show you if there's fentanyl in these products. And I asked an individual the other day who's a person in recovery. He was a very strong opiate addict. He's in recovery now. And I said, did you use fentanyl test strips? Are we distributing something that's not used? He said, oh yeah, we use them all the time on the street. And I said, well, does it stop you from using this product that you purchased? And he said, no. But what we always do, if something tests positive, is we're going to make sure we're with someone and we're going to make sure they have naloxone. So that, I think, is having an effect on our numbers that we see. If we can saturate people with naloxone, we can get ahead of this fentanyl curve, and that is what we're doing right now. But yes, what is very scary is the new substance that's coming around. We've had 6 overdose deaths from it. In other places across the nation, it is much stronger. And we're going to have to put together a plan, and it takes all of us for how we're going to address this. Now, if we can treat people, get them into treatment so that they're not using or buying substances, period, that helps the entire thing. But some of our harm reduction techniques we've been using successfully don't work with this product. Now, I will say our funds from the federal government just approved the purchase of test strips for that
For
substance.
xylazine.
Yes, and so we are ordering some as we speak, so we will be able to distribute test strips for that, but it's scary and it's gonna be really dangerous.
Well, xylazine, a lot of people don't know about xylazine. Xylazine is used by veterinarians. It typically is what you use to tranquilize, or it can be used by animal control to actually tranquilize large animals. So before a vet's going to do surgery on a horse or a cow, they will utilize xylazine and ketamine usually to put that animal under to do whatever procedure they need to do. There has been studies on xylazine for human use. There's a lot of people say there isn't. There has been, and that study said it's not for human use because of what it does to humans. So, and we've seen very well on the East Coast what it's done in Philadelphia, and now it's spread all across the U.S. And we're usually a little bit behind when this stuff happens. Well, now it's catching up with us. But xylazine, when it's used by humans, it creates ulcers that are typically irreversible, meaning because a lot of your IV drug users, whenever they inject, they get ulcers. That's part of being an IV drug user. Well, these ulcers left untreated causes the skin to rot and it causes you to lose a limb. So that's going to be a compounding problem that we're going to be dealing with in the near future because all 50 states have tested positive with xylazine and fentanyl now. But it's also been adulterated in methamphetamine, cocaine, and other drugs. So xylazine is going to be a product now that we see all across Oklahoma, all across the U.S. It's going to be adulterated in all the other drugs as well. The problem with xylazine and fentanyl is whenever you do hit someone with Narcan to bring them out of that opioid state, they're tranked with a xylazine. It's not an opioid, so it doesn't react to Narcan. And that's why we're seeing these overdoses. We will continue to see them, I think, increase dramatically. It's really scary to me because I really think we've made a lot of headway with what we're doing on treatment, Narcan, and the programs that you're talking about making this available like it is. And a lot of people's really critical of that, but that is proven to be effective. And I'm a public safety guy, 100%. Law enforcement guy, drug enforcement guy for over 30 years, violent crimes and drug enforcement. But we know, and you're right, we have to all work together, but we know that those programs are effective. Those numbers start dropping. And we also know that we are recreational people. People that become addicted don't use a drug thinking they're going to be addicted. It starts off recreational and it becomes an addiction. And I don't know, I don't think there's anyone that isn't touched by this. Anyone that says they don't know someone or related to someone that doesn't have an addiction or mental health issue, I would like to meet them because not even me. And so interesting about ACEs because through your office, when your folks came over with my administration, we sat down, we went through the ACEs and my background. And just like the lady that was instructing that day, is very similar. We score very, very high on ACEs. I should be the other way. That doesn't mean you always do, but also I thought it was very good to do this because I also think it could have a little bit for law enforcement, what you see going on when things go bad and you see cops acting out. I really think that we can use ACEs to help us. So that's why I introduced that into I think it's the coolest thing and it's so real. But it made me realize a lot of stuff. But anyway, I just think that's an avenue that we ought to make available to all law enforcement as well.
Absolutely.
But I think it will also help. It will help cut down on some of the things that happen in law enforcement that we wonder, why did that person do that? I think it will help you understand some of that.
Yeah, and law enforcement not only, just like many Oklahomans may have a history with trauma in it, but they're out there experiencing trauma every day.
Yes.
And then oftentimes feel like, well, I shouldn't be affected by this. I should be tough. I should, I trained for this. I shouldn't be affected. But we know that law enforcement, just like anyone else, is greatly affected by experiencing trauma repeatedly. And there has to be an outlet and an understanding for persons to be able to process that, to be able to even take some time for self-care so that when they are out in these stressful situations and doing their job, that it's not triggering, they're not already so stressed that it's easy to have a trigger.
And if we educate each of us It helps us to recognize what's going on. And we talk about the trauma every day. We're kind of getting off topic. I know, I'm sorry. But you're exactly right. You do see this day in and day out. But if people do recognize other law enforcement, other administration people, and once again, removing the stigma away from, oh, we're so big and tough, it can never happen to us. Well, it has, and that's our number one killer for us, is ourselves. So we got to be able to talk about that and not be so, oh, it could never happen to us. But you're absolutely right.
And I have to say, and I told you I was a talker, so stop me whenever you want. When we, the legislature and ourselves partnered a couple of years ago to make available tablets in all law enforcement vehicles, and sheriffs around the state use these tremendously, and you can push a button and you have a mental health professional at your fingertips to help with whatever scenario or person that you've come in contact with. But when we did that, we made sure to put a button that was just a law enforcement button only. So one is for someone you've come into contact with and you're going to get a mental health professional to help you through that. But the other is for law enforcement specifically. They push that button to talk to someone anytime they want. And it routes it, makes sure it's way outside your area. It's nobody in your community or whatever. And you can talk and process what you've been going through. It doesn't matter if it's at home, if it's at work, or an incident you just saw. And we did that specifically because of what you're saying, is because we talk about reducing suicide, but males in a certain age group are our number one folks dying by suicide. And then you put people who have access to means, who have very stressful jobs, and you just have a scenario where we can lose many of our best folks. And so we really wanted to help with that. So we try to be there for law enforcement as well.
Absolutely. It's not just law enforcement, it's first responders in general.
Yes,
we see
first
that stuff
responders in general.
day in and day out.
Yes.
It really does affect them. Sheriff, in reference to fentanyl, as we move forward, and I know we talk all the time, and there's different stuff that we all got going on and trying to counter this. What are some of the things that Oklahoma County is trying to do in reference to address the fentanyl in Oklahoma County? Other than law enforcement, I mean, we have to have enforcement action. That's a fact. We can't escape that either. But what are some of the things that you guys are doing right now trying to address the fentanyl problem?
I think the big thing is education. I always grew up with a term or a little slogan my mom always told me. It's like, in all things, get an understanding. And I think if you provide understanding to your community how dangerous this substance is, and how much access there is to this substance, that we can help them make the right decisions. And that is our SROs, educating the kiddos in their school systems about this drug, about how it presents, about, hey, this may look like what you're taking, but it very well may be this drug, fentanyl. And then also educating everything up into our triad program with our senior citizen community, educating them on what that looks like, so that they can be well aware. And I just think that's the big push for us. Outside of the enforcement capacity, it's let's provide understanding and education so that our citizens are well aware of how this presents when someone's under the influence, and how to take care of them should they fall victim to it. And so,
absolutely. I think that obviously we have to do enforcement, but I think two of the most important things is treatment and education. And I think we've gotten a lot better at treatment. We're making it more available, but I think we've got to do a much better job at education. That's just like what we're sitting here doing today. That's why we're doing this, is we hope that we can reach so many people by talking about this. Also kind of reduce the stigma that is out there about addiction and mental health. But education is very, very important.
Yes, sir.
And I do appreciate each of y'all being here today to cover such an important topic that is affecting Oklahoma dramatically, because overdose deaths, because we are more likely in the state of Oklahoma to die from a drug overdose death than from a gun or a car accident. And if you think about that, that's pretty tragic. And if you look over the 20-year history of overdose-related deaths, we've lost more people in 20 years to fatal drug overdoses than we did to the Vietnam War, and that's sad. And that's a war that everyone here is very familiar with, as we grew up and read about or talked about. We're losing more people in 20 years to drug overdoses. We're not doing enough about it.
I specifically want to give a shout out to Oklahoma County, though. We had some figures come in this week that between first responders in Oklahoma County, and that was fire, police, and sheriff, have done over 800 reversals this year. That's how many lives they saved this year. So although as we see things creeping in that may not be as effective of, that's 800 people that would have died.
And that's in one county.
That's in one county.
One county.
One county.
You talk about all 77 counties, the way we've infiltrated all the law enforcement, first responders with naloxone, those numbers would be great. I mean, Tulsa County is what, 100,000 people less
That's it.
than Oklahoma County right now?
Yeah.
Same thing, those numbers, because the chief from Broken Arrow I talked to quite a bit, sit on a couple different boards with, they're dispensing all the time too. We did a panel recently, and they talked about the numbers just the PD did alone, and it's just astronomical. But if you remove those numbers away, you're talking about 2, 3, 4, maybe as much as 10,000 more people that's been saved.
That's right.
And then you talk about, you know, the machines just, and put in households. You think about individual, that goes unreported, by the way, that we don't even know about.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That many lives have been saved. But once again, we got to let people know how to get this stuff. And we will put that address up on our website.
Great.
And if y'all will as well, so people know how to get the naloxone, I think that will benefit as well.
Yes, sir.
And our statistics show that of people who die by overdose, the majority had someone else that was present. And if they had just had naloxone, they could have prevented that death, which is why, as a society, we've got to think about this like any other first aid issue, that you need to have it on you. You just do. You never know when you're going to be in a situation where you can save a life.
There is not a school in the state of Oklahoma, or probably in the U.S., that should have this present. I don't know that there's a government building that shouldn't have this present anywhere, because I think we'll see that it will help us on those numbers as well. Well, I want to thank each of y'all for being here. Does anyone want to add anything? Sure.
I would just say I want to thank all of y'all for the work that you do every day. It's some of the toughest work out there, and I just want to thank you so much for the battle that you're fighting against this coming into our state and being distributed in our state.
Well, I think we're right there with you. I think it's a partnership that maybe we hadn't had in the past that I think is working. Just like your folks coming over and us doing ACES and even educating us more on some stuff. Y'all can educate us, we can educate y'all, but that's why we work together.
Well, I will say one thing. You come thinking you have a pretty good understanding of the situation. You brought an entirely different perspective,
Yes.
even for me today, and some insight into some of the proactive things you're doing. So I found that extremely rewarding, and I'm very interested in what you had to say about the ACEs and how that could play into even how we function better and do our jobs better. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Thank y'all for being here today.